Hey guys, tonight we're going back to the exact moment humanity discovered one of its greatest talents, turning perfectly good food into alcohol. So before we begin tonight's deeply questionable journey through human history, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these slow dives into the strange side of the past. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. It's always comforting knowing people around the world are relaxing together, while learning how humanity accidentally speedran intoxication before inventing basic hygiene. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Long before humans built cities, invented money, or developed the deeply confusing ability to send emails while still forgetting birthdays, alcohol already existed quietly in nature. Deep in prehistoric forests, fruit regularly fell from trees and baked under the heat of the sun. Wild yeast floating invisibly through the air landed on the fruit's sugary surface, triggering fermentation. Somewhere millions of years ago, an ancient ape ate one of these fermented fruits and suddenly felt strangely relaxed, despite living in a world where almost everything could kill him. And honestly, that probably felt amazing. Scientists today believe early human ancestors evolved an attraction to the smell of ethanol, because it often signaled ripe, calorie-rich fruit. To prehistoric creatures struggling daily against starvation, every extra calorie mattered. Fermented fruit carried stronger scents, making it easier to locate in thick forests. Evolution basically trained our brains to think, that weird sweet smell might solve some problems. Unfortunately, evolution forgot to include the sentence, maybe stop after 3. Even today, wild animals accidentally become intoxicated. Birds smash into branches after eating fermented berries. Elephants reportedly stagger around after consuming rotting fruit. Monkeys have been observed fighting each other over fermented snacks, proving that nature invented drunken arguments thousands of years before humans invented taverns, sports bars, or uncles who ruin holidays. For early hunter-gatherers, encounters with natural alcohol were probably common. Honey trapped inside hollow trees could ferment after rainwater mixed into it. Forgotten berries sitting in animal skins slowly transformed over time. Fruit left in baskets began bubbling mysteriously in the heat. Ancient humans likely had absolutely no scientific understanding of what was happening. They only understood the results. Warmth, dizziness, laughter, reduced fear, terrible confidence. Suddenly, the quiet member of the tribe was loudly explaining how he could definitely outrun a wild boar this time. Another was staring into the fire, explaining that he had figured out existence. Meanwhile, someone else had fallen asleep beside a rock after consuming 6 handfuls of suspicious berries. Humanity was progressing beautifully. Alcohol may have provided temporary relief from brutal prehistoric life. It dulled pain, reduced anxiety, and encouraged bonding around campfires. For a few precious hours, people could forget the constant threats of predators, disease, freezing weather, and the horrifying realization that nobody had invented mattresses yet. And then humans made an important discovery. Fermentation could happen again. That realization changed history forever. Because once humans learned they could intentionally recreate this strange magical feeling, alcohol stopped being an accident of nature and slowly became one of civilization's favorite hobbies, right alongside storytelling, warfare, and making deeply questionable decisions with complete confidence. If the first alcoholic experience came from accidentally eating rotten fruit, the first intentional alcoholic drink was probably mead. Mead is made by fermenting honey with water, and unlike beer or wine, it required no farming, no cities, and no advanced tools. Ancient humans simply needed honey, patience, and the willingness to antagonize large groups of extremely aggressive bees. A surprisingly common human strategy throughout history. Imagine a prehistoric hunter climbing toward a wild beehive hidden inside a tree hollow. Smoke had not yet been perfected, protective clothing did not exist, and medicine was still several thousand years away. This person was essentially risking death for sugar. Honestly, humanity's commitment to sweet things has always bordered on irrational. But eventually the honey was collected, some of it mixed naturally with rainwater inside wooden containers, animal skins, or tree hollows. Wild yeast drifting through the air landed in the mixture. Fermentation began, And after enough time, humans discovered something remarkable. The honey water had become intoxicating. Unlike fermented fruit, mead was sweeter, stronger, and easier to reproduce intentionally. Early humans may not have understood chemistry, but they understood results. Drink this strange liquid, and suddenly the freezing night felt warmer. The endless stress of survival softened slightly, and your friend's terrible singing somehow became emotionally powerful. Scientists believe primitive mead may date back more than 9,000 years. That makes alcohol older than writing, older than kingdoms, and older than most organized religion. Humanity discovered intoxication before discovering proper sanitation, which honestly feels exactly right. Mead quickly became tied to rituals and spirituality. Ancient shamans and tribal leaders likely consumed fermented drinks during ceremonies, funerals, and gatherings around the fire. Intoxication often felt supernatural. People heard voices, saw visions, or felt emotionally connected to spirits and ancestors. To be fair, if you were a Stone Age human drinking fermented honey beside a fire under the stars after surviving another brutal winter, you would probably also believe something mystical was happening. Mead also strengthened social bonds. Drinking together encouraged storytelling, singing, dancing, and cooperation within small tribes. Of course, it probably also encouraged prehistoric arguments no one remembers anymore. Somewhere in ancient history, two intoxicated hunters absolutely ruined an evening by debating whose spear throw was technically more impressive. Some things about humanity never evolve. At some point, ancient humans stopped simply stumbling into fermentation by accident and started intentionally creating alcohol. This was one of the most important discoveries in human history, though it probably did not feel particularly historic at the time. It likely looked more like a tired hunter staring suspiciously at a bubbling container and saying, "Well, it worked again." The first brewers had no scientific knowledge whatsoever. No chemistry, no measurements, no understanding of yeast. They did not know microorganisms existed. As far as they were concerned, liquids just occasionally transformed into magical confidence soup. And honestly, from their perspective, that was accurate enough. Early brewing probably involved trial and error across generations. People noticed that soaked grains changed over time. Fruit juice left in warm conditions became stronger. Honey water slowly bubbled and developed strange effects. Humans began repeating the process intentionally, even if they did not fully understand why it worked. This was humanity discovering controlled fermentation through pure observation. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence from ancient China suggesting humans brewed alcoholic beverages nearly 9,000 years ago using rice, honey, and fruit. These early drinks were cloudy, weak compared to modern alcohol, and probably filled with floating particles nobody wanted to ask questions about. Still, they achieved the desired effect. As settlements slowly grew larger, alcohol became increasingly important in communal life. People drank during weddings, funerals, seasonal festivals, and religious ceremonies. Fermented drinks helped strengthen group identity and social trust. Sharing alcohol around a fire turned strangers into allies and transformed stressful nights into celebrations. Of course, it also almost certainly created the world's first hangovers. Imagine waking up inside a cold Stone Age hut with a pounding headache, trying to understand why your mouth felt full of sand while another tribe member quietly reminded you that you attempted to sing at the moon for an hour. Human progress can be deeply humiliating. Some historians even believe alcohol may have contributed to the rise of agriculture itself. Grain farming allowed humans to produce fermented beverages more consistently. In fact, there is a serious theory that early farming communities may have prioritized grain not just for bread, but for beer, which means civilization itself may have partially emerged because ancient humans collectively decided they wanted a more reliable supply of alcohol. Cities, governments, laws, written language, all potentially connected to humanity's desire to get mildly intoxicated beside a fire without having to chase wild berries through forests first. A strangely believable origin story for civilization, honestly. By the time humans began building the world's first cities in Mesopotamia, alcohol had evolved from an occasional tribal discovery into a permanent part of daily life. Beer was everywhere. Farmers drank it, labourers drank it, priests drank it, and rulers almost certainly drank it, while pretending their decisions were guided entirely by wisdom and not by several cups of fermented grain. This was the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where civilization itself began to take shape. Cities rose from mud brick under scorching heat. Massive temples towered above crowded streets. Trade expanded. Writing emerged. And beside all this incredible human progress, enormous amounts of beer were being consumed constantly. Priorities were very clear. Mesopotamian beer looked nothing like modern beer. It was thick, cloudy, and often filled with bits of grain husk floating inside. People commonly drank it through long reed straws to filter out the solids. Imagine several ancient workers sitting together drinking warm alcoholic porridge from a communal pot through giant straws while discussing irrigation canals and whose goat had destroyed someone's garden again. Civilization had officially arrived. The Sumerians loved beer so much they even worshipped a goddess of brewing named Ninkasi. One surviving hymn dedicated to her contains what is essentially one of humanity's oldest beer recipes. Ancient people were literally singing songs about fermentation thousands of years before modern companies invented commercials featuring slow-motion drinks and suspiciously attractive people laughing near beaches. Beer in Mesopotamia was not just entertainment. It was practical. Fermentation made liquids safer to consume because the brewing process killed harmful bacteria. In crowded cities where clean water could not always be trusted, beer became a safer alternative for many people. In other words, ancient humans accidentally discovered that alcohol could improve public health. A sentence that feels dangerous out of context. Beer also became deeply connected to labour and economics. Workers were often paid partly in beer rations. Some labourers received several litres per day, depending on status and occupation. Imagine finishing a long day hauling stones beneath brutal summer heat and receiving your paycheck in fermented grain soup. Honestly, some modern workers would still accept this if rent prices continue rising. Alcohol had now become fully woven into civilization itself. Religion, trade, labour, agriculture, and social life all revolved around brewing. Humanity was no longer accidentally discovering fermentation in forests. Now it was building entire societies around it. As civilization flourished along the Nile River, the ancient Egyptians embraced alcohol with enormous enthusiasm. Beer became one of the foundations of Egyptian daily life. Rich nobles drank it, farmers drank it, builders drank it. Children even consumed watered-down versions because Nile water was not always safe, and apparently humanity decided very early that slightly fermented was preferable to possibly diseased. A surprisingly reasonable conclusion. Egyptian beer was very different from the crisp modern drinks people imagine today. It was thick, grainy, and nutritious enough to function almost like liquid bread. Some versions were sweet, others sour, and many contained chunks of grain floating around inside. Drinking it probably required both commitment and optimism. Still, after hauling limestone blocks beneath the Egyptian sun all day, people were not demanding craft brewery standards. Beer became so essential that workers building pyramids often received daily beer rations as payment. Entire labour systems partially operated through alcohol distribution. Somewhere near Giza, an exhausted worker once finished dragging enormous stones through the desert and thought, "At least tonight I get bread and several cups of mildly intoxicating grain sludge." And honestly, fair enough. The Egyptians also connected alcohol deeply to religion and mythology. Certain festivals encouraged ritual intoxication, especially those honouring the goddess Hathor. According to myth, Hathor once transformed into a furious force of destruction and nearly wiped out humanity entirely. To stop her, the gods flooded fields with beer dyed red to resemble blood. Hathor drank the beer, became intoxicated, and fell asleep before completing humanity's destruction. Human civilization's earliest recorded solution to divine apocalypse was essentially, maybe she just needs a drink. Remarkably effective strategy. Festivals dedicated to Hathor often involved massive communal drinking, dancing, music, and celebrations that lasted deep into the night. These gatherings blurred the line between religion and partying so completely that modern historians sometimes struggle to separate sacred ritual from what was essentially a giant ancient festival where everyone collectively forgot their responsibilities, so not entirely different from modern holidays. Alcohol also accompanied Egyptians into death itself. Tomb paintings frequently show banquet scenes filled with wine, beer, musicians and servants carrying drinking vessels. Some graves even contained jars of alcohol intended for the afterlife. The Egyptians clearly believed eternity would be significantly improved by access to fermented beverages, which may explain why so many pharaohs appeared unusually calm about the whole being buried inside a giant stone triangle forever situation. While Egyptians mastered beer along the Nile, the ancient Greeks developed something they considered far more refined: wine. Grapes thrived across the Mediterranean climate, and over time, Greek society became deeply connected to vineyards, wine production, and the belief that getting intoxicated while discussing philosophy somehow counted as intellectual achievement. To be fair, they did invent quite a lot. Wine in ancient Greece was not simply a drink. It became a symbol of culture, status, hospitality, and civilization itself. Greeks believed wine separated civilized people from barbarians. If you drank wine properly, mixed it with water, and discussed poetry while reclining on cushions, you were sophisticated. If you drank recklessly without dilution, you were considered uncivilized. Which is ironic, considering many Greek drinking parties ended with someone vomiting near a statue, while another man attempted to explain the meaning of existence to a potted plant. The Greeks even worshipped a god of wine named Dionysus. He represented not only alcohol but also ecstasy, celebration, madness, theatre, and emotional release. Festivals dedicated to Dionysus often involved enormous drinking celebrations, dancing, masks, music, and chaotic public behaviour that probably made sober citizens deeply nervous. Some historians believe Greek theatre itself partly evolved from these festivals. So technically alcohol helped inspire drama both on stage and off stage. Greek symposia became famous throughout the ancient world. These were drinking gatherings attended mainly by wealthy men, where guests reclined together discussing philosophy, politics, art, and poetry, while servants continuously refilled wine cups. In theory, symposia were intellectual events. In reality, many probably started as thoughtful debates and ended with someone attempting to sing epic poetry while visibly struggling to remain conscious. Importantly, Greeks usually diluted wine heavily with water. Drinking unmixed wine was considered dangerous and excessive. Ancient writers frequently warned against uncontrolled drunkenness, though these warnings were often written by people who had clearly attended many drinking parties personally. Research through experience, apparently. Wine also became central to trade across the Mediterranean. Greek merchants transported amphorae filled with wine across vast distances, spreading both alcohol and Greek cultural influence into foreign lands. Entire economies benefited from vineyards and wine exports. Humanity had officially transformed alcohol from a survival discovery into a massive industry. And somewhere in ancient Athens, a philosopher was absolutely insisting his latest drunken realization would permanently change human thought forever, while his exhausted friend quietly wondered if he would finally go home before sunrise. If the Greeks turned wine into culture, the Romans turned it into an empire-wide lifestyle. By the height of Rome's power, alcohol flowed through nearly every layer of society. Senators drank wine during banquets. Soldiers drank it at military camps. Merchants drank it after long journeys, and ordinary citizens packed into noisy taverns where arguments, gambling, and questionable decisions became nightly entertainment. In many ways, Rome conquered half the known world while slightly intoxicated. Wine was the dominant drink across the empire, though Roman wine often tasted very different from modern versions. Some wines were mixed with herbs, spices, seawater, or honey. Others were aged in clay amphorae sealed with resin. Certain expensive wines became status symbols among the elite, while cheaper wines for the poor could taste rough enough to make a modern person reconsider sobriety entirely. Still, Romans drank enormous amounts of it. Water in crowded Roman cities was not always safe, so diluted wine became a common daily beverage. Even children consumed weak mixtures. Romans generally considered drinking wine completely normal, though heavy drunkenness carried mixed opinions depending on social class and context. Of course, this did not stop anyone. Roman banquets became legendary for excess. Wealthy elites hosted extravagant dinner parties, where guests reclined on couches while servants carried endless food and wine into candlelit halls. Exotic animals appeared as entertainment. Musicians played throughout the night. Poets recited verses while deeply hoping nobody would throw olives at them. Some emperors became infamous for outrageous drinking habits. The Emperor Nero reportedly enjoyed lavish parties filled with wine and performances, while Rome itself struggled with political chaos. Other emperors drank heavily enough to alarm even Roman historians, which is impressive considering Roman historians themselves rarely sounded sober. One Roman writer complained about citizens wasting entire days drinking in taverns. Nearly 2,000 years later, modern humanity continues this proud tradition with remarkable consistency. Alcohol also followed Roman soldiers everywhere. Military camps stored wine supplies, and soldiers often drank diluted wine during campaigns. Imagine marching across muddy roads in freezing rain while wearing heavy armor, only to finally arrive at camp and receive your daily ration of watered-down wine. Honestly, morale probably improved immediately. Yet Roman society constantly balanced admiration and fear toward alcohol. Drinking symbolized celebration, victory, religion, and social unity, but excessive drunkenness represented loss of control. Philosophers warned about addiction, reckless behavior, and damaged reputations. Warnings humanity would continue ignoring enthusiastically for centuries to come. Far to the north, where winters were long and daylight sometimes disappeared for terrifying amounts of time, the Vikings developed their own powerful drinking culture. In Scandinavia, alcohol was not simply recreation. It was survival, celebration, diplomacy, religion, and occasionally the reason someone woke up married to a person they barely remembered meeting beside a longhouse fire. The Vikings brewed ale and mead constantly. Honey was precious, making mead especially valuable, while ale made from grains became more common for everyday drinking. These beverages were usually weaker than many modern drinks, but Vikings consumed them in large quantities during communal feasts that could last deep into the night. And considering they spent much of their lives farming frozen ground or sailing across violent seas in wooden ships, they probably felt they had earned it. Feasting sat at the center of Viking society. Chieftains hosted enormous gatherings inside smoky longhouses illuminated by firelight and crowded with warriors, families, musicians, and travelers. Drinking together strengthened loyalty between leaders and followers. Alliances were formed over shared cups. Oaths were sworn while drunk. Occasionally, terrible ideas were approved with shocking confidence, which helps explain several Viking invasions. Alcohol also carried spiritual meaning. The Norse gods themselves drank heavily in mythological stories. Valhalla, the legendary hall of fallen warriors, promised endless feasting and drinking after death. Vikings genuinely imagined paradise as an eternal banquet where brave warriors fought during the day and drank endlessly at night. Human imagination has always been beautifully consistent. Mead especially held symbolic importance. Poets called it the drink of inspiration. And Norse mythology even included magical mead capable of granting wisdom and poetic skill. Somewhere in medieval Scandinavia, an extremely intoxicated Viking was absolutely convinced he had become a brilliant philosopher, while everyone around him quietly avoided eye contact. Viking feasts could become loud, emotional, and dangerous. Sagas describe arguments escalating into bloodshed after too much drinking. Old grudges resurfaced. Insults spread quickly. One badly chosen sentence could transform a peaceful gathering into a violent feud lasting generations. Modern family holidays, but with axes. Yet drinking also helped Vikings endure brutal winters and isolation. Inside freezing longhouses, alcohol created warmth, storytelling, music, and social connection during endless dark nights. Around crackling fires, surrounded by snow and storms, mead and ale transformed survival into community. And after rowing across icy oceans beside men named things like Skull Splitter, a strong drink probably felt less like luxury and more like emotional therapy. While wine flowed through Greece and ale filled Viking halls, ancient China was developing one of the oldest and most sophisticated brewing traditions in human history. Archaeologists have discovered evidence of fermented drinks in China dating back nearly 9,000 years, making some of the earliest Chinese brewers among the first known alcohol producers on Earth, which means humanity reached inventing alcohol remarkably quickly after inventing containers. Early Chinese alcoholic drinks were made from combinations of rice, honey, millet, and fruit. These beverages were often brewed for rituals, ceremonies, and ancestor worship. In ancient Chinese society, alcohol was not merely entertainment. It became deeply connected to spirituality, political authority, and social order. Naturally, people still found ways to get completely drunk with it. During the Shang dynasty, elaborate bronze drinking vessels appeared across elite society. Kings and nobles hosted enormous ritual feasts where alcohol flowed continuously, while offerings were made to ancestors and gods. Drinking ceremonies reinforced power and hierarchy. The ruler drank first. Guests followed carefully according to status. Human civilization had now invented formal drinking etiquette, which is basically humanity admitting, this keeps getting out of hand unless we establish rules. Some Chinese rulers became infamous for excessive drinking. Ancient texts describe lavish royal banquets filled with music, dancing, and endless alcohol consumption. One legendary story claims a ruler created an entire artificial lake filled with wine for guests to drink from directly. Even ancient historians seem to read this and quietly think, that feels excessive. At the same time, Chinese scholars and philosophers often warned against uncontrolled intoxication. Confucian traditions emphasized moderation, discipline, and proper behavior. Alcohol itself was not evil, but losing self-control through drunkenness reflected poorly on a person's character. A warning repeated across nearly every civilization in history, with extremely limited success. Chinese brewers also became highly skilled at fermentation techniques. Over centuries, they developed complex methods using molds and starters that allowed greater control over brewing. Unlike many early societies relying mostly on accidental fermentation, Chinese brewing increasingly resembled a true science, which was impressive, because meanwhile much of humanity was still discovering alcohol through the ancient experimental method known as leave this sitting here and hope for the best. Alcohol in China also inspired poetry and art. Famous poets wrote about drinking beneath moonlight, sharing wine with friends, or reflecting on life while intoxicated beside rivers and mountains. Of course, modern readers often interpret these poems as profound philosophical reflections, but occasionally they were probably just ancient versions of someone texting emotional thoughts at 2 a.m. after too many drinks. Across the oceans, long before Europeans arrived in the Americas, ancient civilizations like the Maya and the Aztecs had already developed their own powerful alcohol traditions. These societies brewed fermented drinks from maize, agave, cacao, and fruit, creating beverages tied deeply to religion, ritual, and community life. Humanity, separated by entire continents, had independently reached the exact same conclusion. Fermented liquids make ceremonies significantly more interesting. Among the Maya, alcohol often appeared during feasts, religious gatherings, and political celebrations. Elite rulers hosted massive banquets where guests consumed fermented drinks, while musicians played and priests performed rituals beneath towering stone temples. Drinking strengthened alliances and reinforced social hierarchy. It also probably led to at least one noble loudly insisting he could definitely climb the temple stairs without assistance, moments before proving otherwise. The Aztecs developed one of the most famous alcoholic drinks in ancient America, pulque. Made from the fermented sap of the maguey plant, pulque had a thick, milky appearance and carried strong religious significance. According to Aztec mythology, the drink itself was considered sacred and connected to the gods. The Aztecs took alcohol surprisingly seriously. Unlike some societies where heavy drinking became common, Aztec laws often restricted intoxication. Young people especially faced strict rules against drunkenness. Public intoxication among ordinary citizens could result in harsh punishment, which strongly suggests ancient Aztec leaders had already witnessed enough disastrous drunken behavior to conclude, we need laws immediately. Older adults, priests, and warriors sometimes enjoyed greater freedom during festivals and ceremonies. Ritual intoxication played an important role in honoring deities, communicating with spiritual forces and strengthening communal bonds. During certain celebrations, drinking became part of massive public events filled with music, dance, costumes, and sacrifices, a combination that probably created an unforgettable atmosphere for everyone involved, assuming they survived it. Meanwhile, in the Andes, ancient civilizations brewed chicha, a fermented maize drink consumed widely across South America. Entire communities gathered to produce and share it during labor projects, religious events, and political negotiations. Drinking together reinforced loyalty and cooperation. Interestingly, many American civilizations viewed alcohol as something powerful but dangerous, sacred when controlled, destructive when abused. Leaders understood intoxication could unite communities or destabilize them entirely. Thousands of years later, humanity continues balancing those exact same concerns while adding karaoke machines and social media into the equation. Somehow we may have made things worse. By the Middle Ages, alcohol had become so deeply woven into daily life across Europe that many people drank it from morning until night with barely a second thought. Ale, beer, wine, and cider flowed through villages, monasteries, castles, and crowded medieval towns. In some places, finding clean water was difficult, but finding alcohol was remarkably easy. Humanity's priorities remained impressively consistent. For ordinary peasants, weak ale was often safer to drink than contaminated water supplies. Medieval cities could be filthy places filled with open sewage, roaming animals, and streets that smelled like several terrible decisions happening simultaneously. Brewing helped kill harmful bacteria, making alcohol a practical necessity as much as a recreational one. Children even drank weak ale regularly, which sounds alarming today until you remember medieval alternatives included diseases, with names modern people thankfully never encounter anymore. Beer became especially important in northern Europe, while wine dominated regions farther south. Monasteries played a massive role in brewing. Monks across Europe refined beer recipes, cultivated vineyards, and developed advanced brewing techniques while supposedly dedicating themselves to spiritual discipline. Apparently, spiritual discipline paired very naturally with fermentation. Some monasteries produced exceptional alcohol, brewing generated income, supported travellers, and provided safe drinks for local communities. Monks became so skilled at brewing that certain religious orders gained reputations for producing drinks far superior to anything nearby villages could manage. Imagine being a medieval peasant realizing the holiest men in the region also made the strongest beer. Church attendance probably improved immediately. Taverns exploded in popularity during the medieval period. Travellers gathered there for food, news, gambling, music, and endless drinking. Deals were negotiated over ale. Arguments started over ale. Fights definitely happened over ale. Somewhere in 14th century Europe, two men were absolutely screaming at each other about whose pig had crossed a property line, while an exhausted tavern keeper quietly reconsidered all life choices. Alcohol also shaped medieval celebrations. Weddings, harvest festivals, religious holidays, and feasts involved enormous communal drinking. Entire villages gathered around barrels while musicians played and people danced beside fires late into the night. Of course, medieval authorities constantly worried about drunkenness becoming excessive. Religious leaders warned against addiction, violence, and immoral behaviour caused by intoxication. Yet many of those same leaders still consumed alcohol regularly themselves, creating the timeless historical tradition of warning people about something while also participating in it. A tradition humanity continues with remarkable dedication today. For thousands of years, most ancient alcohol remained relatively weak. Beer, wine, mead, and ale could intoxicate people, but they were nowhere near as powerful as modern spirits. Then, humanity made a discovery that would permanently change drinking forever: distillation. This was the moment alcohol stopped gently tapping humanity on the shoulder and started punching it directly in the decisions. Distillation began developing gradually across the ancient and medieval world, especially through the work of alchemists and scholars in the Middle East. Early Islamic scientists experimented with heating and condensing liquids while studying medicine, perfumes, and chemistry. During this process, they discovered that alcohol vapor could be separated and concentrated into far stronger forms. Humanity had accidentally upgraded from campfire storytelling fuel to I absolutely should not send that message fuel. Ironically, many Islamic societies restricted alcohol consumption for religious reasons, yet Muslim scholars still played a critical role in advancing distillation science. Their research spread into Europe over time, where monks, physicians, and alchemists quickly became fascinated by the possibilities of concentrated alcohol. At first, distilled spirits were mainly used medicinally. Early liquors were often called aqua vitae, meaning water of life. Doctors prescribed alcohol for pain, digestion, infections, stress, exhaustion, and probably situations where they simply had no better ideas available, which, medically speaking, was most situations in the Middle Ages. These early spirits were harsh, smoky, and often incredibly strong. Drinking them probably felt less like enjoying a beverage, and more like briefly fighting a fire inside your throat. Still, people quickly noticed the effects arrived much faster than beer or wine, a dangerous innovation for a species already famous for poor impulse control. As distillation techniques improved, stronger alcohol spread across Europe and beyond. Brandy, whiskey, and other spirits slowly emerged from centuries of experimentation. Sailors carried liquor on long voyages because it stored well. Soldiers drank it for warmth and courage. Taverns began serving increasingly potent drinks to increasingly questionable customers. Some rulers even taxed alcohol heavily, realizing humanity would apparently sacrifice almost anything before giving up access to intoxication. Distilled spirits also changed social drinking entirely. Beer and wine had usually been consumed slowly over long meals or communal gatherings. Strong liquor, however, could overwhelm people quickly. Societies suddenly faced new levels of addiction, violence, and public disorder tied to alcohol. Humanity had taken one of its oldest habits and made it dramatically more efficient. History suggests this was inevitable. As exploration expanded across the seas, alcohol became one of the most important supplies carried aboard ships. Sailors crossing dangerous oceans during the age of exploration relied heavily on beer, wine, rum, and other spirits to survive long voyages filled with storms, disease, boredom, and the constant possibility of dying extremely far from home, which tends to increase drinking motivation. Fresh water spoiled quickly aboard wooden ships. Barrels became contaminated with algae and bacteria after weeks at sea, making water foul and unsafe. Alcoholic drinks lasted much longer, so sailors often consumed beer or diluted spirits daily. In many cases, alcohol was genuinely safer than water. Humanity had now fully committed to the strategy of, if the liquid burns slightly, it is probably fine. Beer was common on shorter European voyages, but stronger spirits became increasingly important for long-distance travel. Rum eventually dominated among sailors, especially within the British Royal Navy and Caribbean trade routes. Sailors received daily alcohol rations, often mixed with water into grog, which helped preserve drinking supplies while reducing the risk of dehydration. Of course, reducing drunkenness entirely was never truly the goal. Life aboard ships was miserable. Sailors slept in cramped spaces packed with moisture, rats, and terrible smells. Food spoiled regularly. Scurvy destroyed gums and teeth. Storms could sink vessels without warning. Under these conditions, alcohol provided warmth, temporary comfort, and emotional escape from the horrifying realization that one loose rope could launch you directly into the Atlantic forever. Honestly, most people would drink too. Pirates became especially associated with heavy alcohol consumption. Popular culture exaggerates this enormously, but pirate crews absolutely consumed huge quantities of rum and other spirits whenever available. Ports across the Caribbean became famous for taverns overflowing with drunken sailors. Gambling, shouting, and occasional stabbings caused by disagreements nobody remembered clearly the next morning. So, fairly standard port behaviour throughout history. Alcohol also fueled exploration itself. European empires traded wine, rum, and spirits across vast colonial networks. Entire economies became connected to alcohol production and trade. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean produced molasses used for rum distillation, linking alcohol directly to slavery and brutal labour systems that generated enormous wealth for colonial powers. Behind the romantic image of pirates and sailors drinking beside tropical harbours existed a much darker reality of exploitation and suffering. Yet despite the dangers, humanity carried alcohol everywhere it travelled, across deserts, through frozen seas, into jungles, onto battlefields, and around the entire planet. Apparently, one universal human instinct has always been, we should probably bring drinks. For most of human history, alcohol was local. Villages brewed their own ale. Families made wine from nearby grapes. Mead came from local honey, and taverns served drinks produced only a few miles away. Then the Industrial Revolution arrived, and humanity did what it always does when discovering powerful technology. It mass-produced the problem. Factories transformed alcohol production completely. Brewing and distillation became faster, cheaper, and far more efficient. Huge industrial breweries appeared across Europe and America, producing enormous quantities of beer and spirits for growing urban populations. What had once been seasonal or limited suddenly became constantly available. Humanity had effectively unlocked unlimited access to intoxication. Cities filled with crowded taverns and saloons serving exhausted factory workers after brutal shifts. Men spent long days breathing smoke, operating dangerous machinery, and surviving inside polluted industrial neighborhoods before gathering at bars each evening searching for escape, companionship, or temporary relief from lives that increasingly resembled punishment designed by accountants. Alcohol became both comfort and catastrophe. In many industrial cities, alcoholism exploded into a serious social problem. Cheap gin in 18th century England became infamous during the gin craze, when massive drinking levels fueled crime, poverty, and public disorder. Artists depicted streets full of intoxicated citizens collapsing beside buildings, while politicians desperately searched for solutions. Humanity had finally discovered that making alcohol easier and cheaper might produce unintended consequences. A truly shocking revelation. Temperance movements soon emerged across Europe and America. Religious groups, reformers, and politicians warned that excessive drinking was destroying families and communities. Campaigns against alcohol gained enormous support, eventually leading to prohibition laws in some countries. Naturally, prohibition worked about as smoothly as telling humanity not to breathe near desserts. In the United States, alcohol bans during the 20th century fueled organized crime, illegal bars, smuggling networks, and widespread corruption. Gangsters became rich supplying liquor to populations who had absolutely no intention of suddenly becoming sober, because politicians asked politely. The result was one of history's clearest demonstrations that humans become deeply creative when denied alcohol. At the same time, alcohol advertising exploded into modern culture. Companies transformed drinking into a symbol of success, relaxation, confidence, celebration, romance, and adventure. Entire industries emerged around branding fermented liquids in increasingly attractive bottles, while quietly avoiding discussions about hangovers, regrettable decisions, or waking up wondering why you confidently explained your business ideas to strangers at 2 a.m. Civilization had now fully commercialized humanity's oldest escape. After thousands upon thousands of years, across every continent and nearly every civilization, one fact becomes impossible to ignore. Humans never stopped drinking alcohol. From prehistoric forests filled with fermented fruit to modern cities glowing with neon bar signs, alcohol has followed humanity through every stage of civilization. Empires rose with it. Religions warned about it. Philosophers debated it. Kings taxed it. Poets praised it. Entire societies tried banning it, only to discover that telling humans they cannot drink often inspires them to become dramatically more committed to drinking. Some traditions truly are eternal. Part of alcohol's staying power comes from biology itself. Alcohol affects ancient reward systems deep inside the brain, creating temporary feelings of relaxation, confidence, warmth, and social connection. For exhausted prehistoric hunters, overworked medieval peasants, lonely sailors crossing oceans, or stressed modern office workers staring at unread emails, alcohol offered the same promise. For a little while, life feels lighter. Of course, humanity also learned the darker side of drinking very early. Ancient writers warned about addiction, violence, reckless behavior, and destroyed reputations. Greek philosophers criticized drunken excess. Chinese scholars preached moderation. Medieval priests condemned alcoholism, Entire civilizations recognized that alcohol could unite communities or quietly ruin lives, and somehow humans collectively responded, understood. Anyway, yet alcohol survived because it became tied to something deeper than intoxication itself. Humans drink during celebrations, funerals, weddings, victories, heartbreaks, religious rituals, family gatherings, and lonely nights. Alcohol became woven into storytelling, music, friendship, grief, and memory. It transformed from a chemical reaction into a social ritual. Think about how strange this really is. Somewhere millions of years ago, fruit accidentally rotted beneath the sun. Tiny microorganisms humans could not even see converted sugar into ethanol. One curious primate ate the fruit and experienced something unusual. From that tiny prehistoric moment came taverns, vineyards, breweries, pirate rum, royal banquets, Viking feasts, philosophical wine debates, drunken poetry, questionable karaoke performances, and countless historical disasters that probably sounded brilliant at the time. Civilization itself evolved beside fermentation, and despite all our technology, modern humans are not so different from those ancient ancestors sitting around fires with fermented honey. We still gather together searching for warmth, laughter, connection, and temporary escape from fear and uncertainty. Only now the containers are cleaner, the drinks are stronger, and unfortunately, someone eventually invented group chats, which may have been humanity's most dangerous innovation of all. In ancient Egypt, life was never simple. The sun rose because the gods allowed it. The Nile flooded because divine forces willed it. Your headache, your broken sandals, your neighbour's suspicious goat, and that strange noise outside your mud brick house at night could all have some spiritual explanation attached to them. Egyptians lived in a world where invisible forces constantly hovered around everyday life, watching, influencing, blessing, punishing, and occasionally ruining someone's afternoon for reasons nobody fully understood. To modern people, some of these fears sound extreme, but honestly, if you lived in ancient Egypt, you probably would have been superstitious too. The desert could kill you, the river could kill you, snakes could kill you, crocodiles could kill you, food spoiled quickly, infections arrived suddenly, and medicine often involved honey, herbs, prayers, and a suspicious amount of crocodile ingredients. So Egyptians developed an entire spiritual system designed to protect themselves from the chaos they believed surrounded humanity at all times. That chaos had a name, Isfet. Isfet represented disorder, destruction, lies, disease, and cosmic imbalance. Basically every terrible thing rolled into one invisible force. Opposing it was Ma'at, the sacred balance of truth and harmony that kept civilization functioning. Every ritual, prayer, charm, and offering helped keep Ma'at alive. Without it, Egyptians believed the world itself could collapse into disaster. So yes, even wearing the wrong amulet probably felt stressful. Ancient Egyptians somehow turned accessorizing into a matter of cosmic survival. Protective charms became part of daily life. Farmers wore amulets while working fields. Sailors carried charms onto boats crossing the Nile. Mothers hung magical symbols near children's beds. Wealthy nobles covered themselves in jewellery shaped like sacred animals and gods. One of the most popular protective figures was Bez, a strange dwarf-like god with bulging eyes, a lion's mane, and his tongue sticking out. He looked less like a divine being, and more like a tavern fighter who had slept in a ditch, which was exactly why people trusted him. Evil spirits apparently took one look at Bess and decided to harass someone else instead. Meanwhile, priests performed rituals constantly to push back unseen dangers. Spells were recited over food, medicine, pregnancies, and funerals. Some Egyptians even believed speaking certain words incorrectly could attract bad luck. Imagine trying to relax in a civilization where pronouncing something wrong might accidentally invite supernatural chaos into your home. Suddenly, modern autocorrect problems do not seem so dramatic anymore. Ancient Egyptians did not believe luck alone could protect them. Luck was unreliable. Luck forgot things. Luck probably wandered off halfway through the day and got distracted by a goat somewhere near the Nile. Real protection came from amulets. Small magical objects Egyptians carried constantly to defend themselves against curses, demons, sickness, accidents, and the endless spiritual dangers lurking around every corner of life. These charms were everywhere, around necks, wrists, ankles, belts, beds, doors, boats, and even buried inside mummy wrappings. A person could spend their entire life surrounded by protective objects and still think, maybe I need one more just to be safe. Ancient Egypt practically invented the concept of emotionally supporting yourself through accessories. One of the most famous amulets was the Eye of Horus, also called the Wedjat Eye. According to myth, Horus lost his eye during a brutal struggle against the god Set. The eye was later restored, turning it into a symbol of healing, protection, and wholeness. Egyptians wore it everywhere. Soldiers painted it on shields. Sailors painted it on boats. Mothers hung it near children. The logic was simple. If a magical eye once survived divine violence, maybe it could help you survive food poisoning or an angry crocodile. Another common symbol was the scarab beetle. Egyptians watched scarabs roll balls of dung across the ground and somehow concluded this represented cosmic rebirth and the movement of the sun. To be fair, ancient religion often involved people seeing a bug and deciding it carried the secrets of the universe. Scarab amulets symbolized renewal, protection, and good fortune. Wealthy Egyptians wore beautifully carved scarabs made from precious stones, while poorer citizens used simpler versions made from clay or bone. Everyone wanted protection, even if their budget only allowed discount magical beetle. Children especially received heavy spiritual protection. Infant mortality was frighteningly common, so parents surrounded babies with charms to ward off demons believed to target young children. Tiny necklaces, magical carvings, and protective spells filled Egyptian homes. The god Taweret, a bizarre creature with the body of a pregnant hippopotamus, lion limbs, and crocodile features, became a favourite guardian of mothers and infants. She looked terrifying, which was precisely the point. Egyptians assumed evil spirits preferred easier targets. Even the dead received amulets. Mummies were wrapped with dozens of magical objects placed carefully between layers of linen. Egyptians feared the afterlife deeply, and nobody wanted to arrive spiritually unprepared. Imagine entering eternity only to realise you forgot your protective beetle necklace back at home. Absolute nightmare. Ancient Egypt was deeply obsessed with protection, but protection only mattered because people feared the opposite. Curses. And Egyptians absolutely believed curses were real. Not metaphorically real. Not bad vibes real. Truly, dangerously, spiritually real. A curse could destroy your health, ruin your family, poison your reputation, or follow you into the afterlife itself, which meant every argument, betrayal, theft, or insult carried the potential risk of supernatural revenge hanging over it, like a very angry, invisible bird. The fear of curses became especially powerful around tombs. Egyptians spent enormous amounts of time preparing for death because they believed the soul continued living after burial. A damaged tomb could destroy someone's peaceful afterlife forever, so naturally, many tombs included warnings designed to terrify thieves away. Some inscriptions threatened robbers with divine punishment, disease, or judgment from the gods. Others promised crocodiles, snakes, or eternal suffering to anyone foolish enough to disturb the dead. Ancient Egyptians basically invented the "seriously do not touch this" sign, except theirs involved eternal doom instead of museum security. And honestly, grave robbers still went inside anyway. Humanity has always contained people willing to risk supernatural destruction for shiny objects. One of the greatest fears involved someone learning your true name. Egyptians believed names held spiritual power connected directly to the soul. If your name survived, part of you survived. But if your name was erased, forgotten, or magically attacked, your existence itself could weaken. This was why rulers carved their names onto monuments everywhere. It was not just ego, though there was definitely some ego involved. It was spiritual survival. This fear explains why some disgraced rulers suffered what historians now call damnation of memory. Their names and faces were deliberately destroyed from monuments after death. The female pharaoh Hatshepsut famously had many of her statues and inscriptions damaged after her reign. To Egyptians, this was more than political revenge. It was an attack on eternal existence itself. Ordinary people also feared magical attacks from jealous neighbours or enemies. Some Egyptians created small curse figurines representing enemies, then smashed or burned them during rituals. Others wrote hostile names on pottery before breaking it apart, symbolically destroying the target's power. It was ancient spiritual warfare mixed with the emotional maturity of, "I'm so angry I'm breaking plates." Even priests approached curses cautiously. Magic itself was not considered evil in Egypt. It was a tool. Protective magic defended order, while harmful magic threatened it. The problem was that invisible forces could never be fully controlled, which meant Egyptians lived with a constant uncomfortable truth. Somewhere out there, somebody might genuinely be trying to curse you right now. In ancient Egypt, magic was not reserved for mysterious priests standing dramatically inside temples while holding glowing artifacts under moonlight. Most Egyptian magic was surprisingly ordinary. People used spells for headaches, childbirth, stomach pain, bad dreams, snake bites, relationship problems, and protection during travel. Daily life itself felt dangerous enough to require constant supernatural assistance. Honestly, if mosquitoes the size of birds and Nile crocodiles existed outside your village, you probably would have wanted magical backup too. The Egyptians called magical power Heka. Unlike later societies that often treated magic as suspicious or evil, Egyptians saw Heka as a natural force woven into the universe by the gods themselves. Priests used it, doctors used it, mothers used it, farmers used it. Magic and medicine blended together so completely that sometimes it was impossible to separate the two. A healer might apply herbs to a wound while simultaneously chanting a protective spell against hostile spirits. Nothing says medical confidence quite like, "This plant should help," but let's involve divine forces too, just in case. Some spells focused on protection from animals. Snake bites terrified Egyptians, and for good reason. Egypt contained several venomous species capable of ending your day very quickly. Magical texts included elaborate chants designed to neutralize poison by invoking gods who had defeated dangerous creatures before. One popular myth involved the goddess Isis, curing her son Horus after he was poisoned by a scorpion. Egyptians believed repeating parts of this story during treatment could transfer divine healing power to the victim. Mythology essentially became emergency medical assistance. Dreams also frightened people. Egyptians believed dreams could contain messages from gods, warnings about danger, or attacks from hostile spirits. Bad dreams were not just unpleasant, they might reveal genuine supernatural threats. To defend themselves, people slept with protective charms nearby or recited spells before bed. Some even placed magical objects under pillows for safety. Ancient bedtime routines were significantly more intense than checking your phone and regretting every life choice at 2 a.m. Love spells existed too, because human beings remain human beings in every century. Certain magical texts promised to attract affection, increase desire, or strengthen relationships. Others aimed to cause arguments between rivals. Somewhere in Egypt, thousands of years ago, somebody absolutely sat in a candlelit room, whispering magical revenge spells, because their romantic situation had become complicated. Civilization changes. Human pettiness does not. Even written words carried magical weight. Egyptians believed spoken and written language possessed real power, capable of affecting reality itself. This meant spells had to be recited carefully and precisely. Pronouncing something incorrectly could weaken the magic or create unintended consequences, which must have made every nervous apprentice priest feel absolutely fantastic under pressure. Ancient Egyptians believed envy itself could become dangerous. A jealous glance, an angry stare, or even excessive admiration might invite harm into someone's life. This fear eventually became tied to what many cultures later called the evil eye, the idea that negative energy from another person could cause sickness, bad luck, infertility, accidents, or spiritual imbalance. In Egypt, where unseen forces already seemed responsible for half of life's problems, this belief spread easily. Imagine finally harvesting a good crop after months of exhausting labor under the desert sun. Your neighbors compliment your success a little too enthusiastically. Then suddenly your donkey breaks a leg, your storage jars crack, and your son develops a fever. To Egyptians, this was not coincidence. Somebody's envy may have spiritually poisoned your good fortune. Ancient Egypt was essentially a civilization where people could compliment your necklace and accidentally terrify you. Children were considered especially vulnerable to harmful attention. Parents feared excessive praise could attract dangerous spirits or jealous energy toward infants. Mothers often placed protective amulets around children's necks or painted magical symbols near beds and cradles. The dwarf god Bears appeared constantly in homes because his grotesque appearance supposedly scared evil forces away. His face decorated beds, mirrors, cosmetics, and furniture. Imagine being so spiritually intimidating that your image gets placed on nursery walls specifically to frighten invisible demons. Truly an elite career achievement. Pregnant women also received heavy magical protection. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous, and Egyptians believed hostile spirits targeted mothers during labour. Protective wands carved from hippopotamus ivory featured terrifying creatures and gods designed to guard against evil influences. The goddess Taweret became one of the most beloved protectors of women and children. With her strange mix of hippopotamus, crocodile, and lion features, she looked less like a comforting mother figure and more like something guarding the gates of the underworld, which once again was exactly the point. Even beauty itself carried spiritual risks. Wealthy Egyptians sometimes avoided displaying too much success openly, fearing they might attract envy or supernatural attention. Jewelry, homes, clothing, and status all required balance. Too much pride could offend the gods or invite jealousy from others. Ancient Egyptians somehow managed to make social anxiety into a religious experience. To defend against harmful attention, people used charms, prayers, gestures, and rituals constantly. Some wore the Eye of Horus for protection. Others carried scarab amulets or recited short spells during moments of vulnerability. Life in Egypt felt spiritually crowded. Invisible dangers were everywhere, and one careless glance from the wrong person might supposedly throw your entire existence into chaos. Relaxation was not exactly a major feature of ancient Egyptian culture. Ancient Egypt did not see animals as simple creatures wandering around the landscape. Animals carried messages, spiritual meaning, and sometimes terrifying warnings from the gods. Egyptians observed the natural world obsessively, searching for signs hidden in the behavior of birds, cats, crocodiles, snakes, and countless other creatures. If an animal behaved strangely, people paid attention, because in Egypt, a random bird landing nearby might not just be a bird. It might be destiny arriving dramatically with feathers. Cats became especially sacred because of their connection to the goddess Bastet. Cats protected grain stores by hunting rats and snakes, making them incredibly valuable in Egyptian homes. Over time, people began viewing them as spiritual protectors against evil forces. Hurting a cat was considered horrifyingly unlucky, and in some periods, even accidentally killing one could bring severe punishment. House cats were pampered, mourned, decorated with jewellery, and occasionally treated better than certain members of society. Somewhere in ancient Egypt, a man probably lost an argument to a cat and simply accepted that the cat had higher spiritual authority. Crocodiles inspired a very different emotion: absolute terror. The Nile crocodile was powerful, unpredictable, and fully capable of removing someone from existence in seconds. Egyptians respected these creatures deeply and associated them with the god Sobek. Sobek represented strength, military power, fertility, and the dangerous unpredictability of the Nile itself. Some temples even kept sacred crocodiles adorned with jewellery and fed by priests, which sounds noble until you remember somebody still had to volunteer for feeding the giant holy predator duty every morning. Snakes also carried intense spiritual meaning. Cobras symbolized royal protection and divine authority, appearing on the crowns of pharaohs as the Urious serpent. Egyptians believed the cobra could spit divine fire at enemies threatening the ruler. At the same time, snakes also represented chaos and danger. The monstrous serpent Apophis, enemy of the sun god Ra, symbolized darkness trying to consume the world every night. Priests performed rituals regularly to help Ra defeat Apophis before sunrise. Imagine waking up every morning technically grateful the universe still existed because priests and the sun god won another cosmic snake battle overnight. Birds, especially ibises and falcons, were also seen as divine messengers. Falcons connected to Horus represented kingship and heavenly power. Ibises symbolized wisdom through the god Thoth. Egyptians constantly interpreted animal behavior as signs from the divine world. A civilization already filled with curses, demons, magical spells, and jealous spirits somehow also managed to turn basic wildlife observation into an ongoing supernatural mystery investigation. For ancient Egypt, death was not the end of existence. It was the beginning of an extremely stressful journey, filled with monsters, divine judgment, magical passwords, traps, and endless opportunities for your soul to fail horribly. Egyptians spent much of their lives preparing for the afterlife because they genuinely believed eternity depended on proper rituals and spiritual protection. Dying unprepared was basically the cosmic equivalent of showing up to a survival expedition without food, water, or pants. The soul itself was complicated. Egyptians believed a person contained multiple spiritual parts, including the ka, ba, and ak. The ka needed food offerings to survive after death. The ba could travel between worlds. The ak represented the transformed spirit capable of living eternally among the gods. Naturally, preserving the body became critically important because the soul still needed to recognize and reconnect with it. Hence mummification, a process that turned death into an expensive and deeply uncomfortable science project. Mummification rituals protected the dead from decay and spiritual destruction. Priests removed organs carefully, wrapped the body in linen, and placed protective amulets between the layers. One of the most important charms was the scarab placed near the heart. Egyptians feared the heart might betray them during divine judgment by confessing every terrible thing they had done, which honestly feels unfair because the heart apparently had absolutely no loyalty. The greatest fear awaited in the Hall of Judgment before Osiris. Here the dead person's heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, symbol of truth and cosmic balance. If the heart remained light and pure, the soul could enter eternal paradise. But if the heart proved heavy with sin, things became considerably worse. Waiting nearby was Amit, a horrifying creature with the head of a crocodile, body of a lion, and rear of a hippopotamus. Basically, somebody combined the three animals Egyptians least wanted, chasing them at high speed. If judgment failed, Amit devoured the soul completely, condemning the person to oblivion forever. No paradise, no second chances, just spiritual deletion. To survive this terrifying process, Egyptians buried the dead with magical texts now called the Book of the Dead. These writings contained spells, passwords, instructions, and guidance for navigating the afterlife safely. The dead essentially needed a supernatural travel guide to avoid eternal disaster. Imagine requiring memorized magical dialogue options just to continue existing after death. Ancient Egyptian spirituality somehow managed to turn eternity into the world's most dangerous bureaucratic exam. In ancient Egypt, the gods were not distant beings quietly observing humanity from the heavens. Egyptians believed the gods actively influenced daily life, responded to prayers, caused disasters, granted protection, and occasionally made their opinions known in ways that terrified entire communities. Because of this, priests held enormous power. They were not simply religious figures. They were guardians of cosmic order, interpreters of divine will, and the exhausted middle managers standing between humanity and supernatural chaos. Temples operated like spiritual fortresses. Inside them stood sacred statues believed to physically house the presence of a god. Priests washed, dressed, perfumed, and fed these statues every day through elaborate rituals. To modern eyes, it may sound symbolic. To Egyptians, it was completely real. If rituals failed, the gods might become angry, and angry gods tended to express themselves through famine, disease, political collapse, or giant river problems. Nothing motivates religious dedication quite like believing the universe itself could unravel if you forget a ceremonial prayer. Many Egyptians visited temples seeking answers about the future. Oracles became especially important during periods of uncertainty. People asked questions about illness, marriages, crimes, business disputes, and political decisions. Priests would then interpret signs or movements believed to reveal the god's response. In some ceremonies, sacred statues were carried on platforms by priests, and the way the statue supposedly moved determined the answer. Somewhere in ancient Egypt, entire legal disputes were probably settled, because a group of sweating priests carrying a heavy statue tilted slightly to the left. Dreams also served as messages from the divine world. Some Egyptians travelled to temples specifically to sleep there, in hopes of receiving visions from the gods. This practice, called dream incubation, allowed priests to interpret supernatural messages revealed during sleep. Good dreams might promise healing or protection. Bad dreams could warn of danger ahead. Considering how many terrifying animal-headed gods existed in Egyptian religion, Some people probably woke up from these dreams needing immediate emotional recovery. The god Thoth became especially associated with sacred knowledge, writing, and magical understanding. Priests dedicated to Thoth studied rituals, astronomy, medicine, and spiritual texts. Literacy itself carried mystical importance because written words were believed to contain real supernatural power. Writing something down could help make it spiritually effective. Ancient Egypt essentially treated language like controlled magic. Ordinary people respected priests deeply, but also feared them somewhat. Priests understood rituals, knew secret spells, and communicated with divine forces invisible to everyone else. In a society already obsessed with curses and supernatural dangers, anyone claiming direct access to the gods automatically became both comforting and slightly unsettling. Egyptians trusted priests to protect the balance of the universe, while also probably hoping they would never become personally offended enough to curse somebody on the way home. Ancient Egypt was one of the most advanced civilizations of the ancient world. Its people built massive pyramids, engineered vast temples, developed complex mathematics, practiced medicine, and created a culture that survived for thousands of years. And yet, beneath all that greatness lived a society constantly worried about invisible dangers lurking just beyond human sight. Demons, curses, jealous spirits, angry gods, bad dreams, evil eyes, dangerous names, and cosmic chaos haunted everyday Egyptian life from birth until death. To modern people, some of these fears may sound irrational. But to Egyptians, the world genuinely felt fragile. One failed Nile flood could create famine. A sudden illness could wipe out a family in days. A snake hidden in tall grass could end a life before sunset. Nature itself often appeared unpredictable and cruel. Superstition became a way of imposing order onto a dangerous world. If invisible forces caused suffering, then perhaps rituals, charms, and prayers could keep disaster away. Ancient Egypt survived partly because its people desperately wanted the universe to make sense. This constant fear shaped nearly every aspect of society. Homes filled with protective symbols, jewelry doubled as spiritual armor. Religious rituals governed politics, medicine, agriculture, childbirth, and burial. Even beauty, success, and praise carried hidden risks because envy itself could attract supernatural harm. Egyptians rarely separated the physical world from the spiritual one. To them, everything connected together in ways both visible and invisible. The gods reflected these anxieties perfectly. Protective gods like Bes and Taweret looked frightening because protection itself needed to intimidate evil. The afterlife contained terrifying judges and soul-devouring monsters because morality carried eternal consequences. Priests guarded sacred knowledge because words themselves possessed power. Every layer of Egyptian life revolved around maintaining Mahat, the delicate balance holding back chaos from swallowing the world entirely. And honestly, perhaps that fear helped Egypt endure for so long. Superstition created social order. Rituals united communities. Shared beliefs gave people comfort during uncertainty and grief. A farmer praying over his crops, a mother placing charms beside her child, or a priest reciting sacred words inside a dark temple, all believed they were participating in the survival of existence itself. Thousands of years later, many Egyptian superstitions still feel strangely familiar. People still fear bad luck, evil eyes, curses, and unseen forces shaping their lives. Humans still search for signs, protection, and meaning in uncertain times. Ancient Egyptians may have wrapped their fears in scarabs, spells, and crocodile gods, but underneath it all, they were doing something deeply human, trying to feel safe in a world that never fully promised safety. In medieval Catholic Church monasteries, one of the first signs that a man had abandoned ordinary life was the strange haircut sitting on top of his head. The tonsure, the famous shaved crown surrounded by a ring of hair, became one of the most recognizable symbols of medieval monks. To modern people, it can look oddly comedic, like somebody lost a disagreement with gardening tools. But in the Middle Ages, the tonsure carried deep spiritual meaning. It marked the moment a man symbolically cut himself away from pride, wealth, vanity, and worldly ambition. For many monks, the haircut itself became part of a sacred ritual. A young novice entering monastic life often arrived with the same appearance as any ordinary medieval man. He still carried traces of his former identity, family connections, personal ambitions, maybe even dreams of marriage, land, or military glory. Then came the shaving ceremony. Hair fell to the floor while prayers were recited nearby. In that moment, the monk publicly surrendered his old life and accepted obedience to God and the monastery. Medieval Christianity somehow managed to transform barbering into a deeply emotional spiritual event. Hair mattered enormously during the medieval period. Long, healthy hair often symbolized status, masculinity, and nobility. Kings and warriors took pride in their appearance. Noblemen groomed their hair carefully to display wealth and authority. By shaving part of the head, monks intentionally rejected those values. The tonsure announced to the world, "I no longer belong to earthly society," or at least, "I no longer care about looking attractive while copying manuscripts in freezing stone buildings." Many Christians also connected the circular shape of the tonsure to the crown of thorns worn by Jesus Christ during the crucifixion. Every monk carried a physical reminder of humility and suffering directly on his body. The bald spot symbolized sacrifice, discipline, and devotion. Even vanity itself became dangerous inside monastic culture. Excessive grooming suggested pride, and pride ranked among the most feared sins in medieval Christianity. The tonsure also created separation. A monk could not easily hide his identity in public. Whether travelling through villages, working fields, or praying inside candlelit chapels, his shaved head marked him immediately as part of a religious community. It was both spiritual symbol and social branding. Medieval monasteries understood something modern corporations would later master perfectly. Once people recognize the haircut, they remember the institution. And honestly, the hairstyle probably helped monasteries in another way too. In a world without photographs, uniforms, or ID cards, it was difficult to mistake a monk for anyone else, especially when he walked silently through the village carrying manuscripts while looking permanently halfway through a haircut. Once a monk received the tonsure, his life changed completely. Medieval monasteries were not peaceful retreats where men casually wandered through gardens thinking deep thoughts beside birdsong all day. They were highly disciplined communities ruled by strict schedules, endless routines, silence, prayer, labour, and obedience. The shaved head symbolised humility, but daily monastic life made sure humility stayed fully operational at all times. Most monasteries followed rules inspired by Benedict of Nursia and his famous Rule of St. Benedict. This text organised nearly every part of monastic existence, from sleeping arrangements to prayer schedules to acceptable conversation. A monk's day revolved around structure. Wake before dawn, pray, work, pray again, eat quietly, pray again, copy manuscripts, pray again, sleep briefly, wake up during the night for more prayer. Medieval monks somehow managed to turn exhaustion into a spiritual lifestyle. The monastery bell controlled everything. Bells announced prayer times, meals, labour periods, and sleep. A monk rarely acted according to personal desire. His time belonged entirely to the monastery and to God. Even speaking could become restricted. Many monasteries encouraged long periods of silence to reduce gossip, distraction, and sinful thoughts. Meals were often eaten quietly while one monk read scripture aloud to the others. Imagine trying to enjoy stale bread and thin soup, while someone solemnly reads about eternal salvation in the background. Not exactly a lively dinner atmosphere. The tonsure reinforced this discipline visually. Every time monks saw one another, they saw identical shaved crowns, reminding them they had abandoned individual vanity for collective devotion. Personal identity mattered less than obedience and humility. In many monasteries, monks even slept in shared dormitories with simple beds and rough blankets. Privacy barely existed. Your spiritual growth happened collectively, alongside dozens of equally tired men trying not to fall asleep during midnight prayers. Daily labour formed another major part of monastic life. Monks farmed fields, brewed ale, cooked meals, repaired buildings, cared for animals, and copied books by hand inside freezing scriptoria. Some monasteries became centres of learning, where manuscripts preserving ancient knowledge survived, because generations of exhausted monks spent their lives hunched over ink and parchment. One distracted sneeze could ruin hours of work. Medieval scholarship truly rested upon the unstable foundation of cold fingers and severe back pain. Despite the harsh routines, many monks genuinely believed this lifestyle purified the soul. Discipline weakened temptation. Silence encouraged reflection. Repetition created spiritual focus. The shaved head became more than a haircut. It was the outward sign of a man slowly separating himself from worldly distractions. Though realistically, many monks were probably still distracted occasionally by thoughts of warmer beds, better food, and not having to wake up before sunrise every single day of their lives. You might assume medieval monks all shaved their heads the same way. After all, once you decide to remove part of your hair for God, how many variations could there really be? Surprisingly, quite a few. And naturally, medieval Christians found ways to argue about them with remarkable seriousness. Because if there is one thing history proves repeatedly, it is that human beings can transform absolutely anything into a theological dispute, including hairstyles. Different regions of Christian Europe developed different forms of the tonsure. The most familiar version today was the Roman tonsure, where the crown of the head was shaved while leaving a circular ring of hair around it. This style became strongly associated with the authority of the Catholic Church and gradually spread across much of Europe. But in places like Ireland and parts of Britain, monks often used what historians now call the Celtic tonsure. Instead of shaving a circle on the crown, some Celtic monks shaved the front portion of the head from ear to ear, while leaving hair long in the back. To modern eyes, it may have looked less like a holy monk and more like somebody halfway through losing a bet. Yet to medieval Christians, these differences carried real symbolic importance. The disagreements surrounding these styles reflected deeper tensions inside Christianity itself. Irish monastic traditions developed somewhat separately from Rome for centuries, creating differences in rituals, calendars, and religious practices. Haircuts became visual markers of loyalty and identity. A monk's shaved head quietly announced which religious tradition he followed. Medieval Europe somehow turned barber choices into denominational branding. One major conflict emerged during the Synod of Whitby in the 7th century. Leaders debated whether English Christians should follow Roman or Celtic traditions, including the correct calculation of Easter and the proper form of the tonsure. Imagine attending a church council where grown men passionately debate the spiritual significance of haircut geometry. Medieval theology truly operated on a different level of commitment. Eventually, Roman practices became dominant across much of Western Europe. The circular tonsure spread widely, reinforcing unity under Rome. But the existence of these disputes reveals something important about medieval monastic life. Appearance mattered deeply. The tonsure was never just practical grooming. It symbolized obedience, tradition, and spiritual legitimacy. Monks themselves probably felt this pressure constantly. A poorly maintained tonsure could suggest laziness or lack of discipline. Shaving the head became a regular ritual requiring upkeep and attention. Ironically, a hairstyle meant to reject vanity still demanded maintenance. Even medieval monks could not fully escape the endless responsibilities of hair management. And honestly, there was probably always at least one novice monk secretly terrified every shaving day that the monastery barber would slip slightly and leave him looking spiritually ridiculous for the next several months. Because humility before God is one thing, accidentally receiving the medieval equivalent of a disastrous haircut is another trial entirely. Medieval monasteries feared many things: sin, temptation, demons, heresy, pride, laziness, and occasionally Vikings arriving unexpectedly with axes and extremely negative intentions. But among all these dangers, vanity occupied a surprisingly important place. Monks believed excessive concern with appearance could slowly corrupt the soul, distracting people from God and pulling them back toward worldly desires. The tonsure existed partly to fight this danger directly. You cannot become overly proud of your hairstyle when the center of your head looks permanently under construction. To medieval Christians, pride ranked among the deadliest sins because it placed the self above God. Monastic life aimed to crush personal ego through humility, obedience, and simplicity. Clothing remained plain. Food stayed modest. Personal possessions were limited. Even conversation could be restricted to prevent arrogance or gossip. The shaved head fit perfectly into this system. By removing part of the hair, monks physically rejected vanity and signalled that spiritual matters mattered more than physical beauty. This attitude developed partly in reaction to medieval society itself. Wealthy nobles often displayed status through elaborate clothing, jewellery, hairstyles, perfumes, and grooming. Kings wore luxurious fabrics. Knights styled their hair and beards carefully. Courtly culture encouraged appearance, charm, and prestige. Monks deliberately moved in the opposite direction. Monastic life valued self-denial over self-display. Some church writers even warned that attractive appearances could become dangerous temptations. Long hair, fashionable grooming, and excessive concern for beauty supposedly encouraged lust, pride, and distraction. A monk admiring himself too much risked drifting spiritually away from humility. Medieval monasteries somehow transformed mirrors into morally suspicious objects. Inside monasteries, simplicity became a spiritual weapon. A shaved head reminded monks daily that they had renounced ordinary ambitions. They no longer competed for wealth, romance, or social status. At least in theory, real monasteries still contained human beings, which meant pride and rivalry inevitably survived beneath the shaved crowns and prayer schedules. History contains countless examples of monks arguing, competing for authority, or quietly judging one another's holiness while pretending not to. The irony, of course, is that monasteries themselves sometimes became wealthy and powerful institutions. Certain abbeys controlled large lands, collected taxes, and possessed enormous libraries and treasures. Some abbots lived more comfortably than local nobles. So, while individual monks rejected vanity outwardly, monastic institutions occasionally accumulated impressive levels of earthly influence. Humanity has always possessed a remarkable ability to preach simplicity, while accidentally building giant stone complexes filled with gold candlesticks. Still, for many monks, the tonsure genuinely carried deep personal meaning. Every shaved crown reflected a constant struggle against pride and distraction. The haircut acted almost like a physical prayer, a reminder that spiritual discipline required sacrifice, humility, and the willingness to look slightly strange for the sake of eternal salvation. Medieval monks truly committed themselves to holiness, with an intensity modern people reserve mainly for internet arguments and caffeine addiction. For many medieval men, joining a monastery sounded noble and holy from a distance. Peaceful prayers, sacred books, quiet reflection, perhaps a little gardening under the soft morning sun. But the reality often involved freezing stone buildings, uncomfortable beds, repetitive labour, limited food, strict discipline, and enough sleep deprivation to make even the most devoted monk occasionally question his life choices. The tonsure symbolised sacrifice because monastic life genuinely demanded it every single day. Monasteries were usually cold, brutally cold. Thick stone walls trapped dampness during winter, and heating remained limited. Monks slept in simple dormitories with rough blankets and little privacy. Some monasteries discouraged excessive comfort entirely, believing hardship strengthened spiritual discipline. Imagine waking before dawn inside an icy stone room, while your bald tonsure helpfully ensures maximum heat escapes directly through the top of your head. Medieval monasticism truly committed itself to discomfort with impressive consistency. Food remained plain and repetitive in many religious communities. Meals often centered around bread, vegetables, beans, cheese, ale, and thin soups or pottages. Meat could be restricted depending on the order and religious calendar. Fasting days appeared constantly throughout the year. Some monks probably spent half their lives hungry while listening to another monk read scripture during dinner. The body's suffering supposedly helped purify the soul, though it likely also produced a significant amount of silent irritation. Silence formed another difficult challenge. Certain monasteries strictly limited casual conversation. Monks communicated through gestures during quiet periods and avoided unnecessary speech. The goal was spiritual focus and avoidance of sinful gossip. In practice, it probably also created situations where exhausted monks desperately tried explaining complicated tasks through awkward hand signals, while carrying buckets through muddy courtyards. Physical labour consumed much of the day. Medieval monasteries were self-sustaining communities requiring endless work to survive. Monks farmed fields, chopped wood, brewed ale, tended gardens, cared for animals, repaired buildings, cooked meals, and copied manuscripts. Copying books became especially exhausting. Scribes sat hunched for hours over parchment in dim candlelight, carefully reproducing texts letter by letter. One spilled ink bottle could spiritually devastate an entire afternoon. The tonsure itself quietly reflected all this hardship. A shaved crown was not glamorous. It exposed monks to cold weather, sunburn, and public visibility. It reminded them daily that monastic life required endurance and humility rather than comfort. Unlike noble hairstyles designed to impress others, the tonsure existed partly to erase individuality and vanity altogether. Yet despite the hardships, many monks believed these sacrifices brought them closer to God. Suffering carried spiritual value. Discipline created inner strength. Simplicity freed the soul from worldly distractions. Medieval monks genuinely thought eternal salvation justified freezing mornings, endless prayers, and eating suspicious bean stew beside silent men with matching haircuts. And honestly, that level of commitment is difficult not to respect at least a little. Behind the shaved heads, rough robes, and strict routines, medieval monasteries were ultimately built around one central purpose: prayer. Everything else, the silence, the discipline, the fasting, the simple lifestyle, existed to help monks separate themselves from worldly distractions and focus entirely on God. Monastic life was designed to create distance from ordinary society. In many ways, monks lived like people trying to step partially outside the normal flow of human existence. Most monasteries followed carefully organized prayer schedules called the Divine Office. Throughout the day and night, bells summoned monks to the chapel for communal prayer. Before sunrise, after sunset, during the middle of the night, the cycle never truly stopped. Services like matins, lauds, vespers, and compline structured time itself around worship. Medieval monks did not simply fit prayer into their schedule. Prayer was the schedule. The atmosphere inside monastery chapels could feel hauntingly beautiful. Candles flickered against stone walls. Latin chants echoed through dark halls before dawn. Incense drifted slowly through the air, while rows of monks stood together with shaved crowns visible beneath their hoods. For many monks, these rituals created moments of profound spiritual peace. For others, especially exhausted novices forced awake at impossible hours, the experience may have felt slightly closer to surviving a holy sleep deprivation experiment. Isolation played an important role in this spiritual life. Many monasteries were deliberately built far from crowded cities, hidden in forests, mountains, islands, or remote valleys. Distance from society reduced temptation and distraction. A monk entering the monastery symbolically left behind politics, family ambitions, warfare, romance, and worldly competition. At least ideally. Human thoughts have always been remarkably difficult to lock outside monastery walls. Silence deepened this isolation further. Some religious orders embraced near-total quiet outside prayer, or necessary communication. Monks spent hours reading scripture, meditating, or working silently beside one another. In these moments, the tonsure became almost symbolic of emptiness itself, a physical stripping away of worldly identity to make room for spiritual reflection. Yet isolation carried psychological challenges too. Monastic writers frequently described battles against loneliness, temptation, doubt, boredom, and despair. Medieval monks believed demons specifically targeted isolated individuals through intrusive thoughts and spiritual weakness. A monk praying alone in a candlelit cell at night may genuinely have feared invisible evil forces lurking nearby. The medieval imagination rarely allowed anybody to relax completely. Still, many monks found purpose in this quiet existence. The repetitive rhythm of prayer and labour gave meaning to life in an uncertain world filled with war, disease, and instability. While kings fought for power outside monastery walls, monks pursued something they believed lasted longer than earthly glory: the salvation of the soul, even if achieving it required waking up in freezing darkness, beside dozens of equally exhausted bald men chanting in Latin before sunrise. While much of medieval Europe struggled through wars, famines, invasions, and political chaos, monasteries quietly became some of the most important centres of learning in the Christian world. Behind stone walls filled with prayer and silence, monks copied books by hand, preserved ancient texts, studied theology, and recorded history. The same men recognised for strange shaved haircuts and endless chanting were also responsible for saving enormous amounts of knowledge that otherwise may have vanished forever. Inside monasteries, special rooms called scriptoria became places of intense concentration. Here monks spent countless hours bent over wooden desks, copying manuscripts letter by letter onto parchment. The work demanded patience bordering on supernatural endurance. One small mistake could ruin an entire page. Ink froze during winter. Candles provided poor lighting. Hands cramped constantly, and yet monks continued copying texts because books were precious beyond imagination. The tonsure quietly reflected this scholarly identity too. A monk's shaved crown symbolized withdrawal from ordinary worldly life, so he could dedicate himself to spiritual and intellectual pursuits. While knights trained for war and nobles competed for land, monks preserved scripture, philosophy, history, science, and classical literature. Medieval civilization survived partly because generations of exhausted bald men refused to let important books disappear. Many monasteries copied religious texts first and foremost: Bibles, sermons, prayers, and theological writings. But monks also preserved works from ancient Greece and Rome. Writings by philosophers, historians, poets, and scientists survived because monks kept reproducing them century after century. Without monastic libraries, much of ancient knowledge might have been lost permanently to time. Some monks became highly educated scholars. They studied astronomy, mathematics, medicine, music, and languages. Monasteries developed libraries that grew into intellectual centres, attracting students and travellers from distant regions. Ironically, institutions originally built to reject worldly ambition became some of the most influential educational systems in medieval Europe. Of course, copying manuscripts was not always peaceful spiritual fulfillment. Many monks openly complained in the margins of books about exhaustion, cold weather, poor lighting, and sore backs. Some scribes left sarcastic notes begging future readers to appreciate how miserable the work had been. One exhausted monk famously wrote that writing damaged the eyes, bent the back, and crushed the ribs. Medieval monks invented academic burnout long before modern universities perfected it. Still, their dedication shaped history. Every carefully copied manuscript represented an act of preservation against chaos and forgetfulness. The monastery became more than a place of prayer. It became a fortress protecting memory itself. And somewhere inside those candle-lit scriptoria, rows of monks with matching tonsures quietly carried civilization forward one painfully handwritten page at a time. For centuries, the tonsure stood as one of the most recognizable symbols of Christian monastic life. A shaved crown instantly identified a monk, priest, or religious scholar almost anywhere in medieval Europe. But like many traditions that seem eternal, the tonsure slowly began to change over time. Religious reforms, shifting fashions, political upheavals, and changing attitudes toward monasticism gradually weakened the practice, until the famous bald circle largely disappeared from everyday religious life. Part of this decline came from changes inside the Catholic Church itself. During the later Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, criticism towards certain monasteries began to grow. Some religious communities had become wealthy and politically powerful, owning lands, collecting rents, and sometimes living far more comfortably than the humble ideals originally intended by monastic life. Critics argued that many monks cared more about influence and luxury than spiritual discipline. The tonsure still symbolized humility, but not everyone believed the symbolism matched reality anymore. Then came the enormous upheaval of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. Reformers like Martin Luther criticized monastic institutions heavily, rejecting many traditional practices associated with medieval Catholicism. In Protestant regions, monasteries were dissolved, religious orders disappeared, and the tonsure lost much of its cultural importance almost overnight. A hairstyle that once symbolized spiritual devotion suddenly became associated by critics with outdated religious authority and corruption. Even within Catholic regions, the practice slowly evolved. Priests continued receiving ceremonial tonsures for centuries, but the shaving often became smaller and less visible over time. By the modern era, many clergy no longer maintained the dramatic medieval style familiar from paintings and manuscripts. Society itself changed too. Public appearance mattered differently in modern Europe, and religious institutions gradually adapted to new cultural expectations. Practical reasons probably played a role as well. Medieval monks lived in isolated communities where identical appearance reinforced discipline and unity. Modern clergy interacted far more with ordinary society. Walking through crowded cities with a large shaved circle on your head became less spiritually symbolic and more socially awkward. Humanity has always possessed limits regarding how much attention it wishes to attract in public. Still, the tonsure never disappeared entirely from memory. It remained deeply connected to the image of medieval monastic life. Quiet stone monasteries, candlelit prayers, handwritten books, and disciplined men separated from ordinary society by both belief and appearance. Even today, one glance at the famous haircut instantly evokes an entire world of bells, chanting, silence, and cold monastery corridors. And honestly, few hairstyles in history have ever carried such strange power. The tonsure transformed a simple act of shaving hair into a public declaration that a man had abandoned worldly life completely. Medieval monks may have looked unusual, but their shaved heads quietly symbolized one of the most radical choices a person could make in the Middle Ages: walking away from the world entirely. To modern people, the medieval tonsure can seem amusing, strange, or oddly impractical. It appears in paintings and films almost like a visual shortcut for monk. One shaved circle, one brown robe, and immediately everyone understands the character spends his days praying in cold stone buildings, while carrying candles dramatically through hallways. But for the men who wore it, the tonsure represented something far deeper than appearance. It symbolized an entire way of life built around sacrifice, discipline, humility, and the search for spiritual meaning. Medieval monks lived in a world filled with uncertainty. Wars erupted constantly. Disease spread unpredictably. Famines devastated communities. Most ordinary people lived hard lives shaped by labour, instability, and fear of death. Monasteries offered an alternative existence, structured, disciplined, isolated from much of the chaos outside. The tonsure marked the physical beginning of that separation. Once the hair was shaved away, a monk visibly belonged to another world. The haircut also reflected one of the central ideas of medieval Christianity, that spiritual growth required rejecting pride and worldly attachment. Wealth, vanity, ambition, and physical beauty were often viewed with suspicion because they distracted people from God. The tonsure deliberately removed part of a monk's appearance and individuality. It reminded him daily that his identity no longer centered on personal success or social status. In a society obsessed with rank and hierarchy, that was a radical statement. At the same time, the tonsure connected monks to one another. Whether in a remote Irish monastery, a wealthy abbey in France, or a quiet Italian religious community, shaved heads created a visible brotherhood stretching across medieval Europe. Monks shared routines, prayers, labour, and beliefs. They copied books, preserved knowledge, cared for the poor, farmed land, and prayed for the salvation of souls. Their lives could be harsh, repetitive, and exhausting, but many genuinely believed they were serving a purpose greater than themselves. And despite all the discipline, monks remained deeply human. Some struggled with doubt, some complained constantly, some became brilliant scholars, while others secretly fell asleep during long prayers after waking in freezing darkness before dawn. Medieval monasteries were filled not with perfect saints, but with ordinary men attempting extraordinarily difficult lives. To grow up in ancient Illyria was to understand hardship before adulthood even arrived. The land itself trained you. Jagged mountains towered over narrow valleys. Dense forests hid wolves, raiders, and enemies from rival tribes. Winters were cold, roads were rough, and survival demanded strength long before anyone called you a warrior. An Illyrian child learned quickly that life would not protect you simply because you were young. The Illyrians lived across the Western Balkans in territories that today include parts of modern Albania, Montenegro, Bosnia, and Herzegovina, and nearby regions. They were not one united empire like Rome. Instead, they existed as fiercely independent tribes bound together by blood, loyalty, and survival. Each tribe had its own chiefs, customs, rivalries, and warriors. Tribal identity meant everything. Your people protected you, fed you, fought beside you, and buried you. Without your tribe, you were simply another lonely figure freezing somewhere in the mountains. A future warrior's training started early, even if nobody formally called it training. Boys hunted animals in forests, climbed steep terrain, carried heavy loads, tended livestock, and learned how to endure exhaustion without complaint. Life itself became preparation for combat. There were no polished military academies or carefully organised barracks. The mountains served as the classroom, and the lessons usually involved cold weather, hunger, and the possibility of suddenly falling down rocky hillsides. Weapons entered life naturally. Spears, axes, knives, shields, and curved swords surrounded Illyrian communities constantly, because warfare between tribes remained common. Raids could erupt over land, livestock, revenge, or old feuds nobody fully remembered anymore. Somewhere in Illyria, two tribes were probably still angry about something one man's grandfather said 40 years earlier beside a campfire. Evenings around the fire shaped young warriors deeply. Elders told stories of battles, ambushes, heroic deaths, and famous tribal leaders. Songs celebrated courage and mocked cowardice. A boy listening in silence understood something important very quickly. Reputation mattered more than comfort. An Illyrian warrior might die young, but he could still achieve honour through bravery and loyalty to his people. And honestly, fear was always nearby. The mountains looked beautiful, but they were unforgiving. Violence could appear suddenly from forests or narrow passes. A peaceful night could become a raid before sunrise. Every sound in the dark mattered. Every stranger might carry danger. To be raised in Illyria meant growing up with the constant understanding that survival was earned, not guaranteed. An Illyrian warrior did not fight like a polished Roman legionary, marching in perfect formation beneath shining standards. Illyrian warfare was faster, rougher, and deeply connected to the mountains themselves. The terrain shaped every battle. Narrow passes, rocky hills, forests, rivers, and hidden paths turned the Western Balkans into a natural fortress where local warriors held enormous advantages over outsiders unlucky enough to march into the wrong valley. From a young age, Illyrian men learned how to move across difficult ground quickly and quietly. Climbing steep slopes, crossing forests, and navigating rough terrain became second nature. A warrior needed endurance more than elegance. Heavy armour slowed you down in the mountains. So many Illyrians preferred lighter equipment that allowed speed and sudden attacks. Roman writers often described them as fierce, unpredictable fighters who relied on ambushes, raids, and rapid movement rather than orderly battlefield formations. And honestly, if you lived in those mountains, you probably would fight that way too. Why stand neatly in rows waiting to be stabbed when you could throw spears from rocky cliffs and disappear back into the trees? Weapons varied between tribes, but spears remained common because they were practical, deadly, and easier to produce than expensive swords. Axes, daggers, and curved blades also appeared frequently. Shields protected warriors during close combat, though battles often became chaotic very quickly. Fighting in narrow mountain terrain rarely allowed the clean organisation imagined in heroic paintings. Combat involved confusion, shouting, mud, exhaustion, and the very real possibility of tripping over rocks while trying not to die. The Illyrians gained reputations as dangerous raiders across the Adriatic and Balkan regions. Some tribes attacked neighbouring settlements or ambushed enemy caravans moving through mountain roads. Others became feared pirates along the Adriatic coast, launching sudden attacks against merchant ships before disappearing back into hidden coves and coastal strongholds. To outsiders, the Illyrians often seemed impossible to fully control because the landscape itself protected them. Warriors also relied heavily on tribal loyalty during battle. You fought beside relatives, childhood friends, cousins, and men whose families had known yours for generations. Honour and reputation mattered enormously. Cowardice could shame not just the individual, but the entire family line. Songs and stories remembered brave warriors long after death, while cowardly behaviour could become permanent humiliation whispered beside campfires for decades. At night, warriors gathered around fires, sharpening weapons, repairing gear, and listening to older fighters recount past battles. Smoke drifted upward into the cold mountain air while distant wolves echoed through the forests. Tomorrow might bring another raid, another ambush, or another tribal feud reigniting unexpectedly. Because in Illyria, peace rarely felt permanent. The mountains created tough people, but they also created a world where violence could arrive suddenly from behind the next ridge at almost any moment. For an Illyrian warrior, loyalty to the tribe was not just important, it was everything. Your tribe gave you identity, protection, allies, land, and purpose. Without it, survival became nearly impossible in the harsh mountains of Illyria. A man's reputation reflected directly on his family and clan, which meant honour carried enormous weight in everyday life. Respect had to be defended constantly, and insults rarely disappeared quietly. This created a world where blood feuds could last for generations. One killing often led to revenge. Revenge led to another killing. Then another family demanded justice in return. Entire tribal conflicts sometimes grew from events nobody fully remembered anymore, except that our people were wronged. Ancient Illyria occasionally functioned like a massive mountain-wide argument that nobody wanted to be the first to end. Young warriors grew up hearing these stories constantly beside evening fires. Elders recounted betrayals, heroic last stands, raids, and vengeance carried out years earlier. Boys learned quickly that courage brought honour, while cowardice brought shame not only upon themselves but upon their entire bloodline. Reputation outlived the body. A brave warrior might die young yet still earn glory remembered for generations through songs and stories. Hospitality also became deeply tied to tribal culture. Guests who entered under protection were expected to be treated with respect and offered food, shelter, and safety. Violating hospitality rules could destroy trust between clans and ignite dangerous conflicts. At the same time, outsiders remained potential threats. An unfamiliar traveller entering mountain territory would likely be watched carefully until his intentions became clear. In Illyria, kindness and suspicion existed side by side constantly. Warriors formed powerful bonds through shared hardship. Men hunted together, fought together, endured freezing winters together, and survived raids together. Loyalty during battle mattered more than almost anything else. If you abandoned your companions during combat, people would remember forever. Songs praising bravery spread through tribal communities, while stories mocking cowardice spread even faster. Humanity has always enjoyed gossip, especially when combined with public humiliation. Some tribal rituals probably reinforced these loyalties further. Feasts after victories, oath-taking ceremonies, sacrifices to gods, and communal gatherings strengthened bonds between warriors and clans. Drinking, storytelling, music, and displays of courage became part of maintaining social unity. Around the firelight, young warriors listened carefully to older men describe battles against enemies, neighbouring tribes, or foreign invaders like Rome, because eventually the Romans would come in greater numbers. And the Illyrians understood something important long before many outsiders did. Mountains protect fiercely independent people for a long time, but they also trap them inside endless cycles of rivalry and revenge. Tribal loyalty made Illyrian warriors formidable, yet it sometimes prevented true unity against larger enemies waiting beyond the horizon. For an Illyrian warrior, the hours after sunset carried a different kind of intensity. During the day, life involved hunting, guarding mountain passes, tending animals, training with weapons, or preparing for raids. But at night, the tribe gathered around the fire. Flames cracked beneath iron pots while smoke drifted upward into the cold Balkan air. Shadows moved across rough stone walls and wooden beams as warriors, elders, and families shared food, stories, and warnings about the dangerous world beyond the village. These nights shaped Illyrian culture just as much as warfare did. Around the fire, young boys listened quietly, while older warriors recounted raids, ambushes, betrayals, and battles against rival tribes or foreign enemies. Stories preserved memory in societies where history was often spoken rather than written. A warrior's courage survived through the voices of others, long after his death. If a man fought bravely, songs remembered him. If he behaved like a coward, unfortunately the songs remembered that too. Meals were usually simple but important. Bread, cheese, roasted meat when available, wild herbs and strong drink shared communally. Food mattered because survival in the mountains required constant labour. Winters could become brutal, and resources were never guaranteed. A successful hunt or raid might mean the difference between comfort and hunger for an entire clan. Music also filled these gatherings. Flutes, drums, and chanting likely echoed through Illyrian settlements during feasts and rituals. Warriors celebrated victories, honoured ancestors, and strengthened tribal bonds through shared ceremonies. The fire became more than warmth. It became the centre of community life. Outside the circle of light waited darkness, forests, wolves, enemy scouts, and uncertainty. And honestly, those forests probably sounded terrifying at night. Wind moving through mountain trees already sounds unsettling, even when you are not worried about rival warriors sneaking toward your village with spears. Older warriors often used these evenings to teach younger men survival skills and tribal values. Loyalty, endurance, courage, and revenge all passed from one generation to the next through stories and advice. A young warrior learned not only how to fight, but how to carry himself within the tribe. Reputation mattered constantly. One reckless act could dishonor an entire family line. At the same time, fear never fully disappeared. Villages posted guards through the night because raids could happen suddenly. An enemy tribe might attack livestock, burn homes, or ambush isolated travelers before dawn. Every barking dog or distant sound in the mountains could force warriors to reach instinctively for weapons resting nearby. So even during peaceful nights beside the fire, violence always felt close. The warmth, laughter, and storytelling existed alongside the constant understanding that tomorrow might bring bloodshed again. To live as an Illyrian warrior meant learning how to relax with a spear always within arm's reach. For an Illyrian warrior, violence rarely arrived with warning drums or carefully arranged battlefields. Most combat came suddenly, a raid before sunrise, an ambush along a narrow mountain path, a tribal feud exploding during what should have been peaceful negotiations. Life in Illyria could shift from calm to deadly in moments, which meant warriors lived in a constant state of readiness, whether they admitted it or not. Raiding formed a major part of warfare and survival. Tribes attacked rivals to seize livestock, supplies, weapons, territory, or revenge. Cattle especially carried enormous value, so stealing animals from enemies weakened rival communities while strengthening your own. Young warriors often joined these raids early in life, eager to prove courage and earn respect among older fighters. Success brought honor. Failure could bring death, humiliation, or a very uncomfortable conversation with angry relatives back home. Speed mattered more than grand heroics. Illyrian raiders moved quickly through forests and mountain passes, striking before enemies fully understood what was happening. Surprise became a weapon itself. A sleeping settlement might wake to barking dogs, shouting warriors, smoke rising into the darkness, and the sound of weapons crashing together outside wooden homes. Medieval-style battlefield speeches were rare. Most people involved were probably too busy trying not to die immediately. Ambushes terrified even experienced warriors because the mountains provided endless hiding places. Narrow trails winding through forests or cliffs could become death traps within seconds. Rocks, arrows, or spears might suddenly rain down from above before attackers disappeared back into the terrain. Foreign armies struggled badly against these tactics because outsiders rarely understood the landscape as well as local tribes did. An Illyrian warrior could vanish into the mountains almost as quickly as he appeared. This unpredictability created enormous psychological pressure. Trust became difficult outside your tribe. Travelers moved cautiously. Villages maintained guards. Even peaceful gatherings carried tension because old feuds could erupt violently after a single insult or drunken argument. Somewhere in Illyria, two men were absolutely starting a blood feud because somebody said the wrong thing after too much wine near a campfire. Warriors themselves developed reputations based on bravery during these sudden clashes. Men who remained calm during ambushes or fought fiercely during raids gained respect quickly. Stories spread through neighbouring tribes about dangerous fighters, successful leaders, and brutal revenge attacks. Reputation could protect you almost as much as weapons. But the violence also carried exhaustion. Constant feuding meant constant loss. Brothers, cousins, fathers, and friends disappeared in raids or retaliations. Entire communities lived knowing revenge might arrive at any moment. And still, life continued. Fires were lit. Livestock were tended. Children played near mountain villages while warriors sharpened weapons nearby. Because, for Illyrian tribes, Violence was not some distant event separated from ordinary life. It existed beside daily existence constantly, like a storm waiting just beyond the next ridge. An Illyrian warrior did not enter battle believing strength alone guaranteed survival. Like most ancient peoples, the Illyrians saw the world as filled with spiritual forces, tribal gods, omens, sacred rituals, and unseen powers tied closely to nature itself. Mountains, rivers, forests, storms, and animals all carried meaning. Before raids or battles, warriors likely performed rituals, asking for protection, victory, or guidance from the divine world surrounding them. Unfortunately, much of Illyrian religion remains mysterious today because the Illyrians left behind far fewer written records than civilizations like Greece or Rome. Much of what historians know comes from archaeology and accounts written by outsiders, who are often busy fighting the Illyrians rather than carefully documenting their spiritual traditions. Still, enough evidence survives to reveal a world deeply connected to tribal rituals and sacred beliefs. Warriors probably carried charms or symbols believed to offer protection during combat. Weapons themselves may have held spiritual importance. Spears, shields, and swords were not just tools for killing. They represented status, courage, and tribal identity. Some weapons were buried beside fallen warriors, suggesting people believed these objects remained important even after death. Sacred gatherings likely involved feasting, sacrifices, music, and ceremonies strengthening tribal unity before warfare. Fires burned, while elders invoked ancestral spirits or local gods connected to nature and protection. Warriors may have sworn oaths before battle, binding themselves through honor and loyalty. In societies where survival depended heavily on trust within the tribe, these rituals reinforced bonds stronger than simple military discipline. Omens mattered too. Strange animal behavior, unusual weather, dreams, or unexpected events could all be interpreted as signs. Ancient warriors everywhere searched desperately for meaning before battle because combat remained terrifying no matter how experienced you became. An Illyrian warrior preparing for a raid might secretly wonder whether the gods favoured him that night, or whether he was about to become another story whispered around future campfires. Burial customs also reflected this warrior culture. Archaeologists have discovered Illyrian graves containing weapons, jewellery, helmets, and valuable goods, suggesting strong beliefs about status and identity continuing after death. Important warriors were remembered through songs, oral traditions, and funeral ceremonies, honouring bravery and tribal loyalty. A man's courage could survive longer than his body. At night beside the fire, older warriors probably mixed stories of real battles with tales of spirits, ancestors, and divine intervention. Young boys listening nearby learned early that courage involved more than physical strength. A true warrior respected the tribe, honoured the gods, and faced danger even when fear sat heavily in his chest. Because fear absolutely existed. Only fools claimed otherwise. The difference was that Illyrian warriors believed fear had to be mastered publicly, even while storms rolled across the mountains, and tomorrow's battle waited silently in the darkness beyond the firelight. For generations, Illyrian tribes dominated their mountains, valleys, and stretches of the Adriatic coast with fierce independence. Then came Rome, disciplined, organised, wealthy, and relentlessly ambitious. At first, the Romans saw the Illyrians as troublesome raiders and pirates disrupting trade routes across the Adriatic Sea. But over time, Rome wanted something larger, control of the entire region, and for Illyrian warriors, this meant fighting an enemy unlike anything their tribes had faced before. Roman armies operated with terrifying efficiency. Legionaries marched in disciplined formations, built roads through mountains, constructed fortified camps almost overnight, and returned repeatedly no matter how difficult the fighting became. To many tribal warriors, Rome probably felt less like a normal enemy, and more like an unstoppable machine slowly grinding forward through the Balkans. Still, the Illyrians did not surrender easily. Mountain warfare remained their greatest advantage. Illyrian fighters knew every valley, cliff, forest trail, and hidden pass across their territory. They launched ambushes against Roman patrols, attacked supply lines, and disappeared into rough terrain before large forces could respond effectively. Roman soldiers feared these sudden strikes because the landscape constantly worked against them. Marching through Illyria meant exhaustion, uncertainty, and the constant possibility of spears flying from unseen positions above narrow roads. Some tribes resisted fiercely under powerful leaders. One of the most famous was Bato the Dizitiate, who helped lead the massive Great Illyrian revolt against Rome in the 1st century after Christ. The rebellion became so dangerous that Rome committed enormous military resources to crushing it. Entire regions erupted into violence while Roman commanders struggled against tribal resistance across the mountains. And honestly, from the Roman perspective, the Illyrians must have seemed unbelievably stubborn. Every time Rome thought an area was secured, another uprising or ambush appeared somewhere else. For Illyrian warriors themselves, fighting Rome carried enormous psychological weight. Tribal rivalries suddenly mattered less compared to the survival of their lands and independence. Men who once fought neighbouring clans now faced disciplined foreign armies threatening to dominate the entire region. Around campfires, warriors likely spoke about Roman armour, Roman roads, Roman discipline, and the terrifying reality that Rome never seemed to stop coming. But the Romans eventually adapted. They built roads deeper into the mountains, established forts, divided hostile tribes, and slowly imposed control region by region. Superior organisation and resources gradually overwhelmed tribal resistance. Even so, Rome never fully erased the warrior spirit of the Illyrians. In fact, many Illyrians later served within the Roman military itself, becoming respected soldiers and commanders across the empire. Because Rome understood something important very quickly, people tough enough to survive the mountains of Illyria often became extremely dangerous warriors, no matter whose banner they fought under. Even without war, life for an Illyrian warrior remained physically exhausting. Modern people often imagine ancient warriors spending most of their time fighting heroic battles or delivering dramatic speeches before combat. In reality, much of life involved hard labour, harsh weather, constant movement, and survival work that wore down the body long before any enemy spear arrived. The mountains of Illyria demanded endurance every single day. Villages often stood on rough terrain, difficult to farm properly, forcing communities to work constantly just to produce enough food. Warriors hunted, herded livestock, repaired shelters, gathered wood, carried water, and travelled long distances through forests and rocky passes. A man who could not endure hardship outside battle would not last long during warfare either. Food depended heavily on season, hunting success, and tribal stability. Bread, cheese, meat when available, wild plants, and simple stews likely formed the core of many meals. Winters could become brutal in the mountains, especially during periods of conflict when raids disrupted supplies. Hunger was never some distant, abstract fear. It lived close beside daily life constantly. Clothing also reflected practicality rather than luxury. Wool cloaks protected warriors from cold winds sweeping through the hills. Leather boots wore down quickly against rocky ground. Shields, weapons, and gear required constant maintenance. Nothing stayed comfortable for long. Rain soaked everything. Smoke clung to clothing. Mud found ways onto every surface imaginable. Ancient warrior life smelled far less heroic than paintings usually suggest. Illness and injury added further danger. Even minor wounds could become infected. Broken bones or deep cuts might permanently weaken a fighter's ability to survive. There were no advanced hospitals waiting beyond the battlefield. Healing depended on tribal knowledge, herbal remedies, endurance, and luck. A warrior who survived combat still faced the possibility of dying days later from infection beside a smoky village fire. And psychologically, the pressure never truly disappeared. Warriors lived, knowing violence might return suddenly at any moment. A peaceful season could collapse into raids, feuds, or foreign invasions without warning. Men remained alert constantly because relaxing too fully could become deadly. Yet despite all this hardship, Illyrian communities developed strong resilience. Shared labour, tribal loyalty, storytelling, rituals, and communal gatherings helped people endure difficult lives together. Around the fire, warriors laughed, argued, sang, and remembered victories, because moments of connection mattered deeply in such an unforgiving world. That hardness shaped the identity of Illyrian warriors more than any single battle ever could. The mountains demanded toughness long before enemies arrived. Surviving daily life itself became a form of training, and honestly, By the time an Illyrian warrior finally faced combat, he had already spent years fighting cold weather, exhaustion, hunger, dangerous terrain, and the general chaos of ancient mountain life. At that point, another armed man charging towards you probably just felt like the universe adding one more inconvenience to an already difficult week. To be an Illyrian warrior was to belong completely to the mountains. The harsh terrain shaped your body, your instincts, your loyalties, and even the way you understood life itself. You grew up surrounded by steep cliffs, dark forests, cold rivers, and isolated tribal villages where survival demanded endurance from childhood onward. By the time a boy became a warrior, hardship already lived inside him like a second heartbeat. Life in Illyria never allowed softness for very long. Violence remained close constantly. Tribal feuds, raids, ambushes, Roman invasions, hunger, brutal winters, and dangerous journeys through unforgiving terrain. A warrior learned early that safety was temporary and reputation mattered deeply. Courage earned respect. Loyalty protected the tribe. Cowardice followed a family for generations. Yet Illyrian warriors were not simply violent men wandering endlessly through mountains looking for conflict. They belonged to tightly connected tribal communities built around kinship, ritual, memory, and shared survival. Around the fire, stories preserved ancestors and heroes. Songs remembered victories and losses. Elders passed down lessons about honor, revenge, loyalty, and endurance. Every generation inherited both the strength and the burdens of those who came before. The mountains also created a fierce independence that outsiders struggled to control. This is partly why even powerful empires like Rome found the Illyrians so difficult to dominate fully. Tribal warriors knew the terrain intimately and fought with the desperation of people defending not just land, but identity itself. Rome eventually conquered the region politically, but the reputation of Illyrian toughness survived long afterward. In fact, many Illyrians later became respected soldiers and commanders within the Roman world itself. The same endurance once used against Rome eventually strengthened the empire's armies. History has a strange habit of turning former enemies into valuable allies once enough time passes. Still, the memory of the Illyrian warrior remained tied to something older and wilder than imperial politics. It remained tied to the image of mountain fires burning beneath cold skies, while armed men watched the darkness carefully beyond the village.